I'm Dalton Delan. I'm a columnist for the Berkshire Eagle. And this is Eagle Reels, where we take you beyond the news. My very special guest today, Melissa Hoffer, the Massachusetts climate chief. Welcome, Melissa.
Welcome, Dalton. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Well, Governor Healey is the first in the nation to establish such an office. Why did she do that, and why have you taken on this role?
Well, I am almost 100% confident that while this might be the first such position in state government, it won't be the last. And that is because climate change is something that touches on every aspect of state government, and that's also true of federal government and local government. So when you think about the way that we've typically dealt with climate change in the past, it's largely lived within the purview of environmental agencies. So at the federal level, that was EPA. At the state level, it tends to be our Department of Environmental Protection and some of the other agencies that live within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. But that's not sufficient to deal with the threat of climate change because, now we can see, and we actually, because the physical signal of climate change is so strong, we can all see it in change precipitation patterns, and this is the lost winter, many people are referring to it. So it's really showing up, and you can see it affects our transportation system. You can see last year, if you were in an area in Massachusetts, and I know you all were, we certainly were here on Beacon Hill, the smoke from the fires up in Canada, it's a big public health issue in many, many different ways. It's a public safety issue. It's an issue that relates to budgetary considerations. So you really need to have, whether you're the president, like President Biden set up the Office of Domestic Climate Policy, or like Governor Healey, you really need to have your whole team on board thinking about and driving climate change in all of their work, whether it's economic development or housing and the like. So that's why that's really important. And I like to think about it as injecting climate change into the DNA of each of these agencies.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned, by the way, I was thinking just this morning that actually today was John Kerry's last day in his climate role for the president. So I felt particularly privileged to be talking to you today. So I feel like the states have such a big role, and I think that's been underplayed, and you're in the lead taking that on, right? I mean, that seems very interesting to me.
Well, I've been, we're so fortunate to have had Secretary Kerry's service for so long, and his leadership on this issue, has spanned decades, and so enormous gratitude, and of course he's one of our own, so that makes it even more special. So the state piece is really important, and I just want to take 1 second to kind of talk about how the landscape has changed. So typically, through many years from 2014 forward, Massachusetts again, thinking about leadership. Massachusetts was the state, the Attorney General's office at the time, that led Mass versus EPA. That is a seminal environmental law case before the United States Supreme Court that held that greenhouse gases may be regulated under the Federal Clean Air Act. So that set in motion efforts to begin to do that, which have been rebuffed multiple times by the United States Supreme Court, most recently last year in the case called West Virginia versus EPA. So what does that mean? What it means is that exactly what you just said, Dalton, it's really up to the states, because EPA can do very progressive things on climate. It can be doing the right thing on climate, and you've got an administrator at EPA, and you've got all kinds of efforts within the executive branch working hard on climate. But when that stuff gets up to the Supreme Court, our chances are not good anymore. This is not a court that's been very friendly at all to environmental regulation, period, and has just finished gutting the Clean Water Act, but is certainly not friendly to climate regulation. So that means the responsibility really does shift to the states, and the states have actually been doing a pretty tremendous job. And this is across the board, red or blue set aside. When you look at states now that are relying on wind power, on solar power for the majority of their energy sources, those are largely red states in the Midwest. So that has to do with states putting in place appropriate incentives to drive the market. And people see now, climate change is a very important motivation for renewable energy, but really it's cheaper. It's beaten out gas. It's certainly beaten out coal. So it's actually a cheaper source for us to use. Now, you asked me a little bit about systems thinking and why that is so important in this context. And that's because, for most people in our professions, we went to school and we were trained to specialize in something. I was a teacher, then I was a lawyer, and my education is highly specialized, and the training I had as a professional is highly specialized. We're not really trained as generalists or to see the connections between things. And then, of course, government agencies are set up that way. We're stovepiped. Areas of expertise, very important, we need them, all within particular agencies, but we don't necessarily think about how these things relate. What are the economic development impacts of what we're doing over here on solar siting? How does our solar siting incentives really relate to forestry and the sequestration that we know that we need to achieve? So making sure that those dots are being connected, elevating that discussion, making sure we have the right people in the room so that when we're going to be doing a housing bond bill, we're thinking about, well, what incentives can Secretary Augustus put in place? And he's partnering with us on that so that we are directing that investment, assuming that the legislature signs off on that proposed bond bill, those investments will be incentivized to go towards electrified public housing, towards electrified affordable housing, and towards decarbonized affordable housing, whether it's new or retrofit. And it's a chance for us to look at that whole package and say, well, this is our opportunity both to improve quality of life for people living in state-owned public housing and to decarbonize that. So you see a line item in there. That's just one example. But those are the ways where we're trying to put our teams together. And, we had a similar story on the economic development bond bill that was just filed last week. That's incredibly important because it's great for climate. It's super, super great for jobs. And it's a place where Massachusetts does what we're good at doing, which is leading. We're good at leading on technology, and we are leading life sciences globally. And we're one of 5 states in the country right now leading charge on clean energy technology and climate tech. So we want to secure our position there. And we also want to be thinking about ways that we can, drive the greatest emissions reduction and also resilience, because that is the other thing that we have not thought very much about, and not just Massachusetts, but really everybody's behind the power curve on this one. We are now in a situation where we have to achieve very deep emissions cuts in a short period of time, while we're also dealing with much more disruptive impacts of climate change. So thinking about resilience, how to improve the technology around it, and also how we're going to be able to, make the investments that we need both on the decarbonization side. And when I say decarbonization, what that means is getting the fossil fuels out. No fossil fuels for electric power generation, no fossil fuels for heating, and no fossil fuels for transportation.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I mean, that's exactly a place where I've been thinking about that. In fact, in Massachusetts, I think may also be the leader in the incredibly quick conversion of a majority of homes to heat pumps away from oil and gas heating. And, it seems to me another example where perhaps we all sort of think, oh, these things are so big, what could I really do? But with that little kind of incentive that can come, the change actually has been remarkably quick, has it not?
I'm so glad that you raised that point. Massachusetts is doing a good job on investing in heat pumps. We're getting beat by our neighbors up in Vermont and in Maine. And that is in part because those folks really, by and large, they kind of leapfrogged us because they went from largely oil home heating systems, and it's just easier. They went right to then when it was time to replace those units to heat pumps. Here, a lot of folks adopted gas, and those gas systems are still relatively new. So it's a different kind of economic proposition to switch it out. But we're catching up, And we've got a lot of really good incentives. And we had the catalyst of the Inflation Reduction Act come along. So for everybody who's listening today, please know that when your water heater breaks in the middle of the night, please buy a heat pump hot water heater and you get 30% off. It's a tax credit that you can get through the IRA. And you can get those tax credits for investments in heat pumps now too. And we're doing a lot of work to get people trained up. Here's another example. Secretary Tutwiler, who is our education secretary, has put a lot of investment into training opportunities for students so that they have, the equipment in their classrooms and they can actually learn how to repair and install a heat pump unit or a mini split, or however you think about it. So getting the students excited about it, that's a great climate career. Getting the workforce developed, making sure that we have, consumers understanding the massive incentives that are available to them, and they will also cover discounts on upgrades of your electrical panels, because you usually have to do that if you have heat pumps installed. So yes, lots of opportunity right now, and I love what you're saying, Dalton, about the role that all of us have to play, because it's critically important. Everybody's going to have to do something in regard to this. And one way you can do it is support strong climate policies. And the other way you can do it is to kind of think about, the changes that you can make on your own budget in your own home or in your apartment.
Melissa, maybe you won't have this at the tip of your tongue, but is there a place, look, for the average viewer, they may not know, where do I get those incentives, whatever?
Mass Save, just Google it. And Mass Save is a program that ratepayers pay for. There's a teensy bit of money that comes off of every, it's like $1 per kilowatt hour. I forget what it is exactly, but it's a tiny amount of money, but it ends up building a fund that's worth over $1 billion annually. And then we use that money to help ratepayers make these improvements at home. They can help you also with improving your building envelope so that your home is efficient. And when you do get that heat pump, then you're using it efficiently. So Mass Save.
Let me shift gears for a moment to something else that I think may surprise people. I think even our own citizens in the state may not be aware of what a big farming state we have. 7,755 farms, of which here in the papers purview in the Berkshires, there's 475. And in fact, the Berkshire farms have the largest average size in the state, 123 acres per farm. So farming, obviously can be very impacted by climate. Any effects we're seeing already? What are you seeing? What can we do?
Well, now we're going to have a longer interview because this is pretty much my favorite topic ever. But first of all, to your question about impacts, yes, farming is being massively impacted across the United States. There's I believe it was the Senate Joint Economic Democrats put out a report in 2023, and it's all about the impacts of heat in particular. But you begin to see, agricultural workers in particular, you're not seeing quite these effects in Massachusetts yet, but agricultural workers in particular are one of the most heat affected sectors. They miss a lot of days at work and they miss hours, their total aggregate hours lost is huge. So there are economic effects of that. There are health effects when folks are out working and they become dehydrated, and there are health impacts associated with that. And there's also the fact that, over time, as we lose crops due to heat or drought, it has driven up the price of certain vegetable oils in the United States. It has impacted the availability of certain staple grain crops like wheat. And here, when you think about last summer, now this isn't out in the Berkshires, but in the Valley, we had only 1,000 acres of farmland underwater as a result of those July floods, and folks lost their crops for the year. It was right before a lot of stuff was getting ready to be harvested. And because during that flooding event, there were a lot of releases of pollution to the Connecticut River, the water was polluted, and some folks may not be able to cultivate in this year, in this coming season. So this raises a lot of questions about the ways that we have to help, not just farmers in this context, but towns. A lot of damage sustained last year. Leominster, 10 inches of rain in a 6-hour period. North Andover, $30 million worth of damage from a microburst. We could go on and on. So that is one of the reasons why in her State of the Commonwealth speech, you heard the governor talking about her proposal in our budget this year to create a fund. This is a disaster response and resilience fund that would be available for towns and farmers when you have a disaster like that that's not federally declared. Because right now we don't have a place to go for that. We can't go to the Economic Stabilization Fund. We came up with, I think, about $20 million to help the farmers last year due to the extraordinary efforts of the governor and other cabinet secretaries in raising those funds. But we need something sustained over time. So the proposal would be for us to take 10% of capital gains revenue, which is roughly $70 million a year, put it into a fund where it would aggregate. It could not be used for general fund purposes at any time, and then that would be available. So that's a start. But we're going to have to really support our farms, because the thing about Massachusetts farms that's so special is that they do tend to be diversified. And so it's exactly the kind of thing that you want now that can help make our communities more resilient. And in Massachusetts, I know in my community, at least, I'm out in central Massachusetts, I live near the Quabbin. There's a huge amount of excitement. Young people really want to be getting into regenerative agriculture, and it can be a huge way for us to sequester carbon, to make our soils more healthy. And as part of our overall natural and working land strategy in our clean energy and climate plan, we need to be conserving about 850,000 more acres between now and 2050, because if I had the graph, I would show you that as you saw our emissions going down to 2050, we never get to zero. We need our natural and working lands to draw down carbon from the atmosphere and store it. That's how we get to zero. That's how we get that last mile. So it's super important for us to prevent conversion of agricultural lands, to protect them, to encourage young farmers. We've got a new program that's going to be coming out of DAR that will be a pilot of a climate corps. And so these will be, good paying jobs for people who want to be working in regenerative agriculture to get a start off on, working in this space. So it's also just a wonderful way to ensure food security. So there's real resilience benefits to it as well. And to, bring back a little bit of the culture of our communities that for years, we're close knit, and it can help reweave the social fabric a little bit, which is another benefit in a time of disruptive climate change.
You touched on a lot of things close to my heart, the communities and how we bring back that resiliency. Another industry that's impacted by, I think we're experiencing and expected to experience about 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit temperature rise each decade. I think about another important Massachusetts industry, tourism, recreation, butternut in our area, example, ski resort that I've loved since I was a boy. What are you seeing there?
So, this is a challenging topic, because the reality is, the climate projections have been pretty accurate. The warming is occurring faster than models predicted, and there are a couple different theories about why that may be. But on balance, things like, the movement north of the maple sugaring industry, the loss of ski tourism, for example. These are things I remember reading about well over a decade ago, predicted for our area and predicted for New England. So some of those things, and you can see this happening in other places around the world and here in the United States. Some of these places are losing their snow, and snow will become, less predictable. Like this winter, we had so much of that wintry mix. So, this has huge cultural implications, I think. Let's be frank about it, because you were saying, you grew up doing that. And I grew up with the corn picker going through the field at a certain time of year near, towards Halloween. And I also grew up, being around snow and playing in it, and, certain foods that help define our traditions. Last year, we had real impacts to our apple and stone fruit because of the funky weather we had in the spring where it warmed up, and then we had that very hard frost, and people lost a lot of their apple crops. And then I can't, imagine, who are we in New England if we're not having a cider party in the fall. So these are hard things, and they're things that are, I think the benefit of being frank about it is we begin to realize the tremendous value that these things have in our life. And they're not like things you can monetize, but it's who we are as people, and it's worth fighting for, and it's worth making change in order to preserve as much as we can of what we have left. That said, as tourism is going to change around the world and here, there will probably be other opportunities that open up for us here. So it won't all be difficult, but there will be big changes. And some of those changes will be, changes in who lives here, because the Northeast is going to be relatively cooler and wetter. So we're also projected to receive a lot of in-migration. That's people coming from other parts of the country, like maybe the Southwest, where it would be too hot and arid to support larger populations over time, and certainly people coming from other parts of the world. So thinking about the opportunity in that also, we're a place where we largely have a shrinking demographic, or people can't stay here because they don't see enough opportunity. So there will be change to come, and I think your question, it's really making me think about the need to just be honest with ourselves about that, to get really serious about what matters to us, and then to really work together. This is our shot, because as you said, people have to remember that the emissions that have already occurred lock us into a certain amount of warming. You can think of it as global warming in the pipeline. Thinking if you turned off all the machines that emit greenhouse gases today, we'd still be on track for a lot of disruptive climate change. And that's another way for us to think, okay, we got to get serious. We have to wake up, and we need to change that trajectory, kind of like we bent the curve in the pandemic. We need to change that trajectory, and we can.
For an individual or a business watching, any couple of top things you think people can do practically, locally, for themselves, their house, their business? We've touched on at least one or two, but do you have a couple, here's my top few things? If you're cocktail conversation, well, here's what you can do. Don't just,
I have a list of things, so I'll tick through, and I just want to give like one. There's a scientist, Beth Sowen, and she's at Multi-Solving Institute. She's a systems scientist, and she said something to me on a bad day when I was pretty despondent about climate change that really changed my frame for thinking about it. So I want to share it with your listeners. And that is that we really don't know what's going to happen. We have models, we have projections. The big question mark is how we as humans respond. And when systems start to change and when disruption takes place, systems can respond in unpredictable ways. So we can't give up. There's a space between what I call techno-optimism and doomerism. And that's the space we want to be inhabiting. So that's just maybe like to help frame the thinking about the things that you can do at home. So you touched on some of them already when you raised heat pumps. Think about how you heat your home. Think about how to not use energy. We call those negawatts, N as in no. Think about how you can reduce your energy demand across the board. So using energy efficient appliances, that stuff really matters. Making your home as energy efficient as possible. Even if you're just covering up the windows in the wintertime with that plastic sheeting. I used to do that. before I was able to get new windows. So those things make a big difference. You can do that right away. Think about how you eat. I know this one's a little bit more controversial. You don't have to give up meat, but eat less of it. Eat less red meat. Let's be frank about it. We know that that is a place where there's tremendous emissions that come off of that. So, maybe a couple nights or a couple days a week, you're not going to do that, or you try to think of ways to reduce meat in your diet. That's a big one. If you have money to invest, don't invest it in fossil fuels. Don't invest it in the companies that are insuring or financing fossil fuel projects. That's really, really important. Just get your money out of it. Vote with your dollars. Think about the stuff you're buying. Plastic is another really important thing, and I want to quickly make the connection for you. As the fossil fuel companies see the writing on the wall and demand for fossil fuels is going down and will continue to go down, they are increasing their upstream production of plastic because plastic is made from fossil fuels. It's really hard. And believe me, I just bought some cherry tomatoes today and they came in a plastic container and I was hungry and I had a short of time and I did it. So we're not going to be angels, but think about ways that you can reduce plastic in your diet or in your home purchases and try not to do that. Support Governor Healy, support what we're trying to do, support strong climate policies, support what President Biden's trying to do with strong climate policies. Think about all of the stuff that you buy generally and generally try to reduce it. Talk to people about it. That is really important. Be honest. When they're you're running to the post office and it's like a weird 70-degree day in February and people are like, oh, it's beautiful. I don't say that. I will say something like, this makes me uncomfortable because it's not normal. That might not feel right to you, but think about a way to start normalizing it so we can talk to each other about it. Make your communities resilient. I should have started with this one because we know we're going to get more rain. I don't know about you guys. I've been running a sump pump almost constantly since December. I had to upgrade that this year. I've never had water like this in my basement before, ever. By the way, I learned you can get sump pump insurance. I bought it. I recommend that you do the same. It's cheap and it gives you a lot of coverage, but make yourselves resilient. Get to know your neighbors again. Think about what your plan would be if we had a big storm coming. Know who is that older person who lives alone. Know who might need a little extra help and have a plan in place. Start to be thinking about that stuff. And there are real benefits to that because maybe you start having potlucks and maybe you start getting to know people again. So those are just a few things that come to me off the top of my mind. Transportation's another big one. A lot of folks out, where you and I live are rural, so you're not going to be well served by, transit necessarily. But to the extent you can carpool or use an electric bike, or try to figure out other ways to get around, that's the fastest and largest growing source of emissions in the Commonwealth. So when the time comes, right now there is, I think, a total of $11,000 between the federal tax credit and the state rebate towards an electric vehicle, and the state rebate applies to a used electric vehicle. So when the time comes, if you're thinking about replacing your internal combustion engine car, you can think about an electric car if you can do that.
Where should they turn for that? Where should our viewers turn? Would you know that?
That is the Department of Energy Resources. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I did that. I'd like to tell you, I wish it was a little bit easier, but it's well worth doing and you will get the check and it's really worth doing it. So, yeah.
Melissa, I think that's the most actionable list of to-dos I've heard on our series, on our shows. I thank you for that. I thank you and the governor for what you're doing. Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I look forward to seeing you next time on Eagle Reels. Thank you so much, Melissa Hoffer, Massachusetts Climate Chief. And I'll see you also next time in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle. And viewers, if you're already a subscriber, thank you. If you haven't yet become a subscriber, please consider doing so. This is how we keep the critically important local journalism alive in this country. Thanks again.